Working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship.
Dan's treatment of people on his shows was an open secret.
Gender discrimination, hostile work environment, harassment.
How safe can any kids be in that environment?
Dan Schneider now wants to sue Quiet on Set for defamation of character.
He's just mad he's never going to be able to get a job again after this.
Dan Schneider is suing documentary makers and streaming platforms for setting him up to look like a creep and to push a narrative that he's some kind of predator. But in all actuality, his lawsuit isn't helping his case. He might feel like he's some big threat, but even if his defamation case moves forward, he won't be on the winning side when his potential victims like Amanda Bynes or Jeanette McCurdy will be called in to testify and really expose Dan Schneider for good. So let's get into it. Now, I have a feeling that this is a tactic by Dan Schneider and his team to make it so that when you Google him, you see that he is now suing the documentary for making him appear as if he's a criminal, which that is still up for debate. Frankly, I don't believe that Dan Schneider has a case here. I think that he is just trying to create some headlines that make it seem like he could be innocent. I mean, for example, saying that he's suing this docuseries for defamation. They report Dan Schneider has sued Investigative Discovery for defamation over his portrayal in Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV. If you guys have not seen this series yet, it's on HBO Max, and essentially it tells the story of Drake Bell and various employees at Nickelodeon who worked closely to Dan Schneider and their terrible experiences on set. We don't have anyone who have come forward and said that Dan had physically harmed them or had touched them well, actually, no, that's wrong. We haven't had any minors come forward and say this. We actually had costume designers who said that they were pressured by their boss to give him massages. And there's no doubt in my mind that, he did things that were probably illegal in the workplace and definitely far from being okay. But now Dan is accusing the company of falsely implying that he SA'd children who worked on the Nickelodeon series he created and ran. Which I want to be clear, while we don't have any, proof or witnesses or I guess victims who have come forward and said that yes, he had harmed minors in these ways, we've seen a lot of things that suggest this, and it's not the documentary's fault. Because, those clips of Ariana Grande and what he made her do with the potato and sucking on her own toes. I think we could say that's objectively wrong without saying maybe it's not explicitly illegal.
Your uvula is that swingy thing in the back of your throat right here. So there's no way you could get it stuck between a hamster's toes. Sentence number 3. I'm soaking wet! Quick, somebody bring me the ocean! Have you ever tried to get your whole big toe in your mouth? Check this out. Sometimes I wonder if you can get juice from a potato.
Those Ariana Grande clips will never be okay, but Dan Schneider filed a lawsuit on Wednesday in the LA Superior Court, saying his depiction in the 5-part docuseries is a hit job. While it's true that 2 child worked on the network shows, he had no knowledge of their harm and condemned it and was not an himself, he claims, which, he was aware of what happened with Brian Peck, but again, this happened after the lawsuit had already been filed and he had been charged.
Mr. Dan Schneider now wants to sue Quiet on Set for defamation of character because they're painting him as, How do you think that's going to play out? What do you think is going to happen? You're going to go to court and they're going to be like, yeah, you're right. This is defamation of character. Do it. Go to court and watch all that evidence just be piled on top of you, not to mention the people that are recently speaking out about their experiences working alongside you and a part of your network.
Now, Dan is saying that we're calling him some abuser, like some child abuser, which isn't necessarily fact or fiction, but it is true that Nickelodeon child actors allege that Dan fostered a toxic and unsafe work environment for adults and children alike. Actors from his show appeared in the documentary and spoke about being put in situations that were unsuitable for children and reflected on the inappropriate jokes and sketches that they took part in. Again, very much Dan Schneider's fault.
Working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship.
Dan's treatment of people on his shows was an open secret.
So my lawyer filed complaints, gender discrimination, hostile work environment, harassment, and it was so devastating.
How safe can any kids be in that environment?
Now, if Dan Schneider has any case here at all, it's going to surround the suggestions and the mystery behind what could have been. I mean, that one woman was quoted as saying that, like, how could any children be safe in this environment if this is how he's treating the adults? Which kind of leaves an open question to what could have these kids gone through, at Dan Schneider's hands. I mean, we heard Drake Bell reveal that as a child, he was harmed by Brian Peck, his dialogue coach for Nickelodeon, and a close friend to Dan Schneider. Other revelations from the series include 2 female writers saying they're forced to split a salary, and the fact that 41 people wrote letters of support during Brian Peck's trial against Drake Bell. The documentary also pointed out, which we have talked about for years on this channel, that there were other offenders who were present at Dan Schneider's shows and hired by Dan and very close to Dan. So seeing all this, I mean, really, Danny boy, if people think this about you, it's kind of your own fault.
Opening up about his sexual abuse, which began at age 15.
It just became this secret that I had held on to. The whole thing was mental manipulation. One day, I was just on the phone to my mom. I just exploded. I just screamed into the phone everything that had been happening to me.
Let's talk about the case that Dan Schneider is trying to build. Dan's attorneys call the series a hit job according to the lawsuit. In the introduction of the complaint, they write that the producers falsely state or imply that Dan had harmed these children who worked on his shows. One thing I want to point out here is that they say that, in the introduction of the complaint, they make these allegations. Well, I do wonder whether they have the entire complaint or if they were just sent the introduction, because a lot of times when someone wants to garner some press about a story, they will go and send the complaint to the media before even the complaint is truly filed. They write, while it's indisputable that the two did work on these Nickelodeon shows, it is likewise indisputable that Dan Schneider had no knowledge of their harm and was not complicit in their actions. But for the sake of clickbait, rating, and views, or put differently, money, defendants have destroyed Dan Schneider's reputation and legacy through the false statements and implications that Dan Schneider is exactly that. Well, exactly what? Because we've got people over here saying that he forced them to massage. I think that's enough. In the lawsuit, the attorneys argued that the voiceover, graphics, and the docuseries trailer played a part in making it seem like Dan was a harmer. You guys know we can't use certain language on YouTube, so I'm trying to get around it. He's a child harmer, like a abuser. These assets are purposely and intentionally defamatory, and that they falsely and repeatedly state or imply that Dan Schneider is this person and committed crimes in this regard. They continue, they've been interpreted as such by countless average, ordinary, or reasonable viewers. Essentially, this lawsuit saying that if someone had came across Dan Schneider and these Nickelodeon shows for the first time through this documentary series, they would in fact think that Dan Schneider is this kind of monster because of how everything was played out.
The lawsuit accuses Warner Brothers, Maxine Productions, Sony Pictures, and producers Mary Robertson and Emma Schwartz of defamation. If you ask me, that 19 minutes of horrible acting admitted guilt. Suing the producers for falsely accusing him of essaying children? Never once in that documentary is that mentioned. A hostile work environment and being a perv with a foot at best. A Freudian slip on his behalf at its worst.
Now, Dan Schneider told Time magazine in an email statement that the documentary series had some of his mistakes and poor judgment. He said, "There's no doubt that I was sometimes a bad leader, and I am apologetic and regretful for that behavior." But he says, however, after seeing Quiet on Set and its trailer and the reactions to them, I sadly have no choice but to take legal action against the people behind it. Ooh, that's heavy. I mean, I worked with that Emma girl early on. She just asked for what information I had, and I was like, here you go, girl. And I wonder if they would go and uncover our emails or our phone calls or whatever between me and her, because I just was my friend Alexa was like, hey, this girl has some questions, would you answer them? I'm like, sure. I didn't know what I was getting into. To support allegedly false claims that he was a child predator, the lawsuit says that the docuseries explores the perversions of the shows he created. There are statements from people in the docuseries that Dan Schneider made children do things that were very weird and setups that referenced adult content, which I think we can acknowledge that that's true. I mean, have you not seen the Ariana Grande bit?
Is it possible for a teenage girl to drink water upside down? not possible. This has been me in a video. Come on, give up the juice.
In the second episode of the series, viewers are introduced to the Brian Peck and Jason Handy. The lawsuit targets the docuseries repeatedly cutting to images of him while discussing the duo. It claims that the episode continues its manipulative use of its editing and photographs to conflate that Dan Schneider was very close to these men, Brian Peck and Jason Handy, when, I mean, kind of seems like he was. I mean, they didn't like just Photoshop or AI these images. These images do exist. And from my understanding, Dan Schneider is the one who has the say on who to hire. I mean, he could, again, I could be wrong, my opinion, but I would assume since he runs the show, he gets to pick who is employed there. That episode ends with a voiceover from a reporter stating that the suspected child predator charged with kissing and touching a 9-year-old girl had been arrested, but that law enforcement believes that there are many more victims. Dan Schneider claims that producers intentionally chose not to show the perpetrator's likeness or name so viewers can conclude that he, Dan Schneider, was the perpetrator.
Dan Schneider can get mad about what the Quiet on Set documentary said all he wants to, but they never once said anything that wasn't factually correct. And you can't deny that. Like, he's just mad he's never going to be able to get a job again after this.
Dan Schneider in the lawsuit maintains that he was unaware of Brian Peck's crimes until it became public record and that he did not commit any crimes himself. Quote, the only reason to include Dan's image in this context was to falsely equate Dan with Brian Peck, make them seem like they are very similar. The viewer is left to infer that just as Brian Peck was Dan Schneider was also complacent. Notably, producers at one point in the docuseries do note that Dan Schneider was not found to have engaged in inappropriate behavior after then Nickelodeon parent Viacom CBS launched an investigation. He cites the inclusion of the information as proof that the producers were aware that they were advancing false allegations, which kind of has a point. I mean, they made it very clear that Dan Schneider has not been charged with any child crimes, because if you were to watch this without that context, you would think so. So Dan does have a point there, but then the bigger question is, what has he been accused of? What could we dive into? And if this goes to court, there will be discovery and investigation into possible allegations. I mean, people like Amanda Bynes could be called in and asked, did he do anything like this? And what if she were to tell the truth, and the truth included a story that does implicate him? He will have much bigger fish to fry. So I'm wondering if he's assuming the docuseries will settle with him, or at least just pay him all the money they made. Dan stresses that the docuseries should have clarified in the trailer or earlier episodes that he did not commit any crimes. Dan claims the producers acted with actual malice and purposeful disregard for the truth, a necessary element to establish defamation as a public figure. According to the complaint, they chose not to include an interview with a former Nickelodeon president of content. So I guess the docuseries creators did interview a Nickelodeon president who said that Dan Schneider was not a predator. And I guess he wants to revisit that interview and say, hey, you guys had the other side of the story, but you chose not to include it so that you could push this narrative that I'm a monster, which I think we can still have that opinion that he is a monster with what we already know about him. I mean, even seeing the content he created and the scenes that he put these children through is enough for me. The fact that he's making these like writers share a salary, he's making these wardrobe people massage him, it's enough for me. Dan wrote that the documentary went beyond reporting the truth and falsely implied that I was involved in or facilitated horrific crimes for which actual child predators had been prosecuted and convicted. His statement ends by saying that he's not opposed to owning up to his wrongdoings, but he feels that it's wrong to mislead millions of people to the false conclusion that he was in any way involved in horrendous acts like those committed by child predators. Dan Schneider is seeking an unspecified amount in damages and is ordering the producers to remove the allegedly defamatory portions of the docuseries or have it completely taken down, which is a really big ask. And as someone who does not like censorship, who stands by the First Amendment, I would be damned if they got this docuseries removed. This person commented, I can't believe you, Dan Schneider, wrote or allowed these kids to do what they did and not think that you're some kind of a Another person wrote, I don't remember them saying that he harmed kids. They just made it out that he was likely a creep, which is heavily backed by an array of evidence. Another person wrote to Dan that you were okay with the company hiring known predators around your hired chose actors. Please, on top of inappropriate scripts, kids scripts, oh no, Mr. Nasty, take it, be glad you're not in jail yourself, seriously. Another person wrote, only the kids who were can tell us if Dan is innocent. And another person wrote, it's hard to sue someone for stating the truth. So it seems like the public is supporting the docuseries and is joining their side, which I would support as well, especially because I believe in freedom of speech. If Dan Schneider wants to go and create a docuseries to support himself, then go ahead and do it. Fund it. You're a producer. Go ahead and create your docuseries, which will show that you are actually innocent and that you've been a saint this entire time. And then these predators are who's wrong and that you are actually a victim yourself. I would love to see it because I would have to see it to believe it. And I really hope this lawsuit goes forward and we dive into what Dan Schneider really has been capable of. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I'll see you in a new video soon. Bye, guys.